Ed here with a Digital Digest, and today I wanted to share a comparison between the Sony A7R Mark III on the left and the A7R Mark II on the right. Now, of course, the A7R Mark III, a brand new full-frame mirrorless interchangeable lens camera from Sony, $3,200 US, arguably the best camera I have ever put my hands on, at least in my opinion, for my use. The A7R Mark II came out roughly 3 years ago. This is the camera that succeeds it, but its predecessor still has some very strong bones in its body, which is why it lasted roughly 3 years before there was an actual upgrade in its line. Above both bodies, you may have noticed, I have 3 different pieces of native full-frame E-mount glass. We've got the Zeiss f4 16-35, which is still a favorite of mine. I think between price and performance, it really is a very solid option. In the center, we have one of the very first offerings that Sony put out when they launched the first A7, which is the Zeiss f1.8 55mm lens, which is still one of the sharpest on Earth. A prime that I think at its price is really a no-brainer. And then last but not least, I have the all-around lens, the zoom, the good old f4 Zeiss 24-70. Now, there are G Masters of both of these, which are much more expensive and will yield more resolution. And in a perfect world, I would own all of them. But I do not. So this is what I'm working with. The other lens that will be part of today's comparison between these two cameras is the G Master that I do have, which is the 100-400. You see right here. It is a behemoth, but its performance is amazing. No constant aperture there, but I will tell you constant performance. So let's talk about what we're looking at here. The A7R Mark III right now I mentioned is $3,200. What I didn't mention is what is the price point for the 3-year-old A7R Mark II. You're looking at roughly $2,200 to $2,300. On sale, it'll probably get lower, get around to $2,000. So realistically, you're looking at somewhere between an $800 to $1,000 price difference between these two cameras. It could narrow, it could widen, and in today's video, that's what I aim to help all of you with. The decision, of course, which is right for you. Now, if you're not in the Sony ecosystem, if you're a Nikon, Canon user, I'll tell you right now, both of these are fantastic cameras and likely will outperform the gear you're using in one way or another, and also in one way or another underperform it. But one thing that is certain, both will be less expensive options. And that has to be a good thing, right? I mean, if smaller, more performance, lower cost, I don't see anything wrong with that. That's a good thing. But there is no question without any hesitation that the A7R Mark III is going to satisfy professionals, people that are actually earning a living in the DI world, whether they're doing exclusively photo or a combination of still and video. The A7R Mark III is the jack of all trades and the master of all of those trades, much like its predecessor, the A7R Mark II. However, the key improvements we have with the Mark III are the ones that professionals, more than enthusiasts or traditional hobbyists, are going to appreciate because they appeal to that exact need. Performance to the point where you're going to earn a living. That sort of performance isn't necessary for a traditional hobbyist or enthusiast, but that does not mean in any way that I wouldn't suggest to a hobbyist or enthusiast that the A7R Mark III is worth the price difference, because it is worth every penny more. Like I said before, somewhere between, it could be $800 to $1,000, maybe less, maybe more, between the Mark III and Mark II. So with that said, let's talk about some of those professional grade enhancements. The sensor that's under the hood on both of these cameras is pretty much identical. The difference is the processor. The body, the Mark III, like the A9, has been beefed up. Looking at them side by side, it isn't that obvious. In fact, you may not even notice much of the critical design cues that have changed. First and foremost, a more robust, larger, heavier body in order to compensate for lenses like the G Master that just made its cameo appearance. The lenses behind it, either body is completely suitable in terms of balancing and weight to handle these sorts of full-frame E-mount lenses. But if you're looking for faster glass, like the G Master series generally provides, you're going to have very large lenses, just like you would with Nikon or Canon, even though in some instances Sony still does outperform them when it comes to actual weight and overall size. But again, the professional grade features, moving away from the sensor, come down to battery life. You know, here I've got the W series battery that the A7R Mark II leans on, which is fine. It's been around for a really long time, and Sony's continued to crank it out because, hey, if it isn't broke, don't fix it, right? I don't like speaking like that, nor doing a voice. But here we fixed it because we've got the Z, and the Z, you know, the performance, the yield here is more than twice that of the W. What does this mean? It means that, again, if you're earning a living, you need that Z. Sounds kind of odd. Sounds like I'm talking about drugs. If you're working with the A7R Mark II and you've got the W battery, you need a bag of batteries. I'm not saying with the Z you won't inherently also need extra batteries. You will. But that, first and foremost, to me, is one of the most important things, is that people might think it's not a big improvement. It's critical. I mean, what good is the best car on the market with no way to drive it? And that's one of the key differences here. But moving away from the battery, I already said the sensor is pretty much identical outside of the processor and its orientation. I'm not going to get too technical on that. We've got a completely different autofocus system. The autofocus system here, 5 frames per second, is your peak drive mode here on the A7R Mark II, which at its time was top of the line. You could complain, but you couldn't find anything like it with that performance and video capability, unlike any other camera that it was competing with. Now we've got 10 frames per second. That's another thing that if you're a professional, whether you're shooting weddings, whether you're doing fashion photography, a photojournalist, whatever it may be, the A7R Mark III's extra 5 frames is potentially the difference between you getting the shot and not getting the shot. And that's again why I think the A7R Mark II, especially with that price difference, is great for hobbyists. But again, sticking to pros, that's one of the cues where the Mark III clearly, just by far and away, takes a dump on the A7R Mark II. Double the performance is exactly that, double the performance. And with the 399 phase detection points and 425 contrast points, the A7R Mark II has taken full frame to another level, not the A9 level where you've got just a speed machine, but again, a camera that can really do it all for just about every field of professional photography other than sports. And that's not to say that you couldn't shoot sports photography with the A7R Mark III. In fact, I think you'll find many sports photographers will lean on it. But of course, if speed is your ultimate goal, the A9 is the $4,500 route that you need to go on. Another thing, I mentioned the body earlier and how it's a little bit more robust. You can see, hopefully, in this image that I'm setting up here, the grip is slightly larger. So it may not be a huge difference, but I can already tell you in shooting with the G Master lens, again, that will emerge kind of like Nessie. You know, for those of you who don't know what the hell I'm talking about the Loch Ness Monster that doesn't exist. If you're shooting with that handheld, which I hope you're not, but if you are, there's no question the balance is going to be better. In fact, with all of even these lenses, or the 70 to 200, not the G Master, but the f4 G lens, is going to feel far more balanced with this grip. Not because this body is so much larger and heavier, because it's not. If you look at the thickness here, they're very close, but there is a little more chin to this grip. And I'm telling you right now, in practical use and experience, it makes a very big difference. It also is critical that we've moved from a single SD card slot on the A7R Mark II to a dual slot, just like we have with the far more expensive A9. Now, something key to point out here is that it's not all wine and roses. One slot supports UHS-1, the other does not. So when it comes to high-speed storage, you really are only getting one option, but that's still, if you're a professional, I think for the most part, probably enough. You should have a few, if not more than a few, 512 or 256 gig UHS 2 cards that you can actually lean on. So that shouldn't be, I meant UHS 1, stand corrected there, that you really shouldn't run into a storage issue. Battery bay is in the same location that it is on the A7R Mark II. Then we get to the back of the camera, the part you're going to actually be looking at. Excuse the fact that the Mark II is a lot dirtier looking than the Mark III, but bear in mind, one has been getting used a lot more than the one that just came out of the womb on the left. But we have something that's critical. Again, as a pro and to a lot of enthusiasts and hobbyists, we now have a joystick. Right here you see it. We do not have that on the A7R Mark II, which means when you want to move that spot to focus, it's going to be a lot easier to do that manually on the A7R Mark III than it will be on the A7R Mark II. We also have for me personally, one of the biggest design cues that had to change, and that was something I always made note of through all of my Sony reviews, and I've been reviewing Sony cameras forever, is that the video button on the A7R Mark II was in a less than ideal place. Inherently, every time you would start and stop a video, it led to some sort of motion in the body. Here with the Mark III, you can see it is right at the right-hand side of the EVF, which makes an immense difference. I mean, I don't know what the engineers were thinking when they stuck it right where your thumb is. In fact, there were solutions, third-party solutions developed to basically eliminate accidental video presses. Sony implemented firmware updates to actually turn the video recording button off. I mean, this is how clear it has been to Sony for many years. It's time to move the button. I was ready to curse, but I'll keep things classy here, even though that's the wrong word. I don't like that word at all. But the video button is where it belongs, folks. That's the point. The menu button, same position. EVF, I didn't mention that. The EVF now has a higher resolution and wider viewing angle than the A7R Mark II. So you're getting a better electronic viewfinder experience. Now, if you're partial to using the screen, another news flash, you now have touchscreen capabilities on the A7R Mark III, again, making things easier, touch to focus, things of that nature. Sony keeping it light there, but still making a move in the right direction for both pros and enthusiasts and hobbyists that do really want to have that flexibility and scratch their heads as to why Sony wouldn't offer it. In terms of other things, the menu button, again, the ergonomics of how you're going to shoot with this camera, the A7R Mark III as opposed to the Mark II, it is a different experience, even though they're so similar. I mean, the menu button here is on an angle on the Mark II. On the Mark III, much like the video button, it's where it should be. Straightforward, right next to the EVF, easy to press while you're using the camera. And I'm not saying that the menu button on the A7R Mark II is difficult to press, it's just learning from mistakes. We also see the C3 move from the right-hand side of the EVF to the left-hand side, and that's because, again, control, redesign, and layout predominantly based around bringing us that actual joystick, which is non-existent on the A7R Mark II. Pretty much everything else is the same on the back of the camera. Neither of these has a fully articulating LCD display, which I really wish that Sony could implement, but for whatever reason, this is our range of motion. You're looking at it. So don't get too horned up about that. That's all you're going to see out of Sony from any of their cameras, and I mean literally any of them. But let's talk about ports. I'm going to open up all these flaps, which sounds strange, but I'm doing it for you. It's a flap opening. And weather sealing exists on both of these cameras, but as I mentioned in all of my videos, please don't test it if you don't have to. I mean, there's really no good reason to see whether or not these things will survive going through a storm or, dare I say, a hurricane. So basically, you're going to immediately notice that, well, the age difference. I'll start with the A7R Mark II since I've got it right here. We've got a multi-port, an HDMI out, which of course gives you clean video out, then a microphone and a headphone jack. Ta-da! Not a bad feature set at all. Pretty much a complete package. You move over to what looks like a mess here with the brand new A7R Mark III, and you can already tell, hey, there are 3 flaps instead of 2. And that's because there's a lot more going on here. Not only are you getting flash sync and a microphone jack and a headphone jack like you had over here, you're now also getting USB Type-C. And this was one of my biggest critiques of the A9. How do you produce a $4,500 camera in the year 2017? And in my opinion, you being Sony, the leader in digital imaging technology in terms of changing the landscape, pushing what consumers expect to see for their money, and yet you're still using micro USB, the slowest possible charge and transfer method on earth. And well, they obviously listened. I'm not saying to me, but to the obvious answer that, come on, spend the money. This is a very inexpensive add-on. And so you've got that now. You can also charge the A7R Mark III while using it. And being that you have Type-C, the allure there is that if you are using a current smartphone that likely has a Type-C charger, you now have that flexibility. That used to be the story of the micro USB because most phones, other than the Fruit company, did use micro USB. That, however, has become a thing of the past. So we still have the micro USB, and if you're wondering why, it's because Sony does have a proprietary multi-port. They don't call it a micro USB port, even though it is, and that's because Sony has accessories that lean on it, which is another nice thing. If you want to use one of their triggers for video, whatever it may be, Sony's got accessories. Take a look. I've reviewed them in the past, and that's why it still exists. Now, I will say I wish that these flaps were a little bit more robust, like the rest of the body. Man, look at this thing spinning. But I in no way feel that anything on this camera is poorly made. I will point that out while I make that observation. Now, in terms of microphone arrays, both are on the side of the EVF. In my previous update, I had said, I believe I mentioned that the microphone was here. Of course, that is the speaker, not that you're going to be listening to music on either of these cameras. And both speakers are very weak, but certainly better than having nothing. Moving along, Wi-Fi, NFC. Let's talk about what you can do with that. This is somewhere where the A7R Mark II has an advantage. Play memories, which I felt was a well-developed idea. It didn't really necessarily net, I think, what Sony had hoped, which was a complete software ecosystem where developers were going to get involved and consumers and propose things to them so that you could install different apps essentially for your cameras. It didn't work out. And that's sad because something as simple as time-lapse, an app for doing time-lapse shots, exists with the A7R Mark II, but with the A7R Mark III, that is non-existent. So I would like to see play memories on here, but again, that's not what a professional is going to care about. They're not going to be interested in consumer-based apps that were they originated with the idea of trying to capture a market that now Sony has starkly moved away from. In fact, the A7R Mark II was that first big move away with their most expensive full-frame interchangeable lens camera ever at the $3,200 price point. And I'm glad to see that the A7R Mark III did not become more expensive, because one thing I can tell all of you is that as I've watched Sony mature, part of that maturation is raising prices because they know that they really have no competition. Sure, Nikon has something, Canon has something, but they don't have anything like this. And that is why Sony can raise prices, because they're coming in lower to begin with, which is always a good thing, especially as things go on sale, like the A7R. I've gone over body, I've gone over battery life, I've gone over the EVF improvement. Both have 5-axis image stabilization, so if you're going to stray away from the full-frame native E-mount glass, you can, of course, adapt legacy Canon, Nikon, Leica, whatever you want to do, throw it on here. You need an adapter, of course, but beyond that adapter for E-mount, you do have stabilization on board. Now, when it comes to dynamic range, the A7R Mark II on the right still is top of the class. However, the A7R Mark III does slightly best it. In fact, it bests Nikon's D850, which has surprised a lot of people. The D850 does have an advantage in the color profiling realm, but that's something that can be managed in post. Dynamic range, on the other hand, cannot. The A7R Mark II, again, still top of the class, but with the A7R Mark III, you're getting literally numero uno. And that's pretty important if that is at the top of your checklist, and I think for pros, that is. That's another thing to differentiate why I will continue to say that the hobbyist on a budget should be buying the A7R Mark II. If your budget is not a concern, and I didn't say this earlier in the video, but I did say resoundingly the A7R Mark III is the best camera on the market, so it's kind of a given that if money is not an issue, this is where you should be going. I mean, even when you look at the shutter button, you see that the size has been increased. Again, this is all about proportions. Sony wanted to address that imbalance in how small the footprint was in relation to the glass that was sitting on its sensor. So even in the shutter buttons, even in the actual jog dials on the front of the grip right there, they've been beefed up. They're thicker, the plastic is more rigid, it's tougher, and that applies, it's on the back of the camera as well. You can see it right there. If you look at that jog wheel, you can clearly see that that dial is larger on the newer A7R Mark III than it is on the A7R Mark II. So that's another critical thing, and it speaks to, again, all of the retooling and refinements that really do make the A7R III in another class and more than a worthy and compelling upgrade from the A7R Mark II after 3 years of time. I have said it before, I'll say it again, the A7R Mark II lived such a long life because it was an amazing, and still is an amazing, DI tool. But it was time for something new, and that's exactly what we got here. Essentially, what I can tell Sony did is take an already amazing camera and fill out all of the inadequacies that professionals found with the A7R Mark II. And that is the market they were after, which is a great advantage for hobbyists because now this camera has become, that is the Mark II, incredibly affordable. And that's not to say that its original retail price of $3,200 wasn't affordable, because for its performance it was. Now, when it comes to overheating, something that Sony is notorious about, I have not experienced any with the A7R Mark III. The Mark II had its issues. Firmware resolved those for the most part, but there's no question you are less likely to see any overheating out of the Mark III. That's without hesitation. Other things that you should be aware of are that when it comes to, I mentioned the autofocus earlier, shooting, if you're looking for a blackout, a free experience like the A9 has to offer, neither the A7R Mark II or Mark III can accomplish that. However, the Mark III does do a remarkable job compared to the Mark II. Now again, whether or not you're going to shoot mechanical or electronic is really a matter of personal choice. I lean on electronic. I think most do. They want silent shooting. That's part of the beauty of what both of these cameras represent. And that's where the fact that this does have a competitive edge, it's really more than a competitive edge over the Mark II, is very important. Another critical thing. So it's not just that this can do 10 frames and this can only do 5 frames, but then even when you get into the world of that, electronic shutter versus mechanical, if you really want to be able to continuously shoot without losing your subject, you're going to do a much better job. You're going to have a much better ability with the Mark III than you are with the Mark II. And I've seen people refer to the Mark II as like a still life camera. And I understand why, because when it came to autofocus capability, it was far from perfect. The Mark III addresses that directly. So there really aren't too many things that I can find wrong. I mean, I mentioned I don't like that the play memories has been removed, but there aren't too many things that I can find wrong in terms of design cues, technical capability, execution. I mean, battery life has improved remarkably, which I put so much emphasis on, because what good is a $3,200 camera that you cannot use? And of course, as I mentioned, the Mark II, that's offset by inexpensive batteries. You're not going to find this Z battery at a good price. I'll tell you that right now. If you're wondering if you can get knockoffs, I wouldn't. It's still too new. Eventually, I'm sure that copies will be around that will work with this. They probably exist right now. Once I gave up the A9 because it really wasn't the product for me, and I knew that Sony had the Mark III in its back pocket. After all, it's only been 3 years, right? That's when I knew I would see basically all of the features I wished the Mark II had come to fruition here in the Mark III. And that's exactly how my experience has been thus far with the Mark III. Wi-Fi performance better. Is it in another league? No. And that's something where, again, I had hoped that it would be, but just the sheer fact that we've got all of the things that make the Mark III feel like it's something manufactured today, which even the A9 was missing by not having Type-C, speaks to Sony trying to correct a obvious flaw immediately. Now, to give you an idea of what these bodies look like once they have a lens on board, let's do that. I mean, after all, what do I have these lenses out here for? And for me personally, my favorite of this group is really the 16 to 35. That's what most of my samples outside of what I'll shoot with the 100 to 400 will actually be taken with. The Prime 55 f1.8, don't get me wrong, is an amazing piece of glass, but I like zoom lenses. What can I do? So I'm going to go ahead and put on the Zeiss 24 to 70 on the Mark II because that will give us the most comparable literal body size that we could have between these two cameras. I could bring out Nessie, but I'm not going to. Believe it or not, that's mounted on the A6500, maybe a comparison for another day. And now you've got both cameras with lenses on that are fairly similar in terms of stature and size. Of course, the wide angle Zeiss a little bit larger. It's a wide angle lens. That's just the nature of the engineering. I also think it's built better than the 24 to 70, but that's a different conversation for a different video altogether. But as I've been mentioning, the profile of the Mark III even makes shooting with these sorts of footprint lenses, this size, far more comfortable. A good example was in my first day of use with the Mark III. The first thing I noticed was that I could actually one-hand the camera and go to other controls without feeling like I was going to lose steadiness in the hand. That is not something that I could say about the Mark II. Is that a game breaker? Absolutely not. But it's just one of those usability things that you notice and pick up on immediately. And as soon as I saw that already, from a usability standpoint, made the Mark III superior. Besides all of the technical capability and what's under the hood being improved dramatically. In terms of something I didn't mention, the 4K video on both of these I did mention is amazing. But what key advantage the Mark III has is that with the Mark II, you really had to shoot in Super 35, the 5K, and then undersample to the Super 35 in order to get the best video quality possible. Sony, with the A7R Mark III, decided why not make it so that both full frame 4K at 30p as well as at, if you want to go with their highest quality setting or 24p, it doesn't really matter. You're still going to get amazing footage, but they really made it so that you could use the full sensor or Super 35 without compromise. Whereas with the Mark II, Super 35 was what you had to do if video was your primary. Because even though you could use the full sensor, you simply weren't going to get the same quality of video that you would using Super 35. Now, it's up to you. You really aren't going to have a degradation of video quality, whether you use Super 35 or the full sensor. Although the Super 35 will still perform better in low light, which is something noteworthy. And that applies to both of these, but definitely more so with the Mark II because of what I just told you, and that's technological advancement. You may have also noted, even on the actual mode dial, you've got 3 customizable presets. With the A7R, you only have 2. This is more of Sony acknowledging that they need to address what pros need, which is quick, on-the-fly control of their DI tool of choice. And that's what I see here. I see attention to detail, critical improvements that are exactly what both consumers and pros alike are looking for. And that's what the A7R Mark III brings that the Mark II was missing. It's a level of maturity and competency that one didn't have because it was the first of its kind, and the second that took 3 years in the oven to finally rear its head does have. So now to answer the real question at 30 minutes. Which is right for you? If you are coming fresh into the Sony ecosystem and you've got the money, without hesitation, do yourself a favor and get the Mark III, because you will not regret it. The Mark II, on the other hand, if, again, you're brand new to the Sony ecosystem and budget is an issue, I can easily tell you that the Mark II is a very solid option, if not the best on the market, other than the Mark III, because the money you will save here, you will be able to invest in native E-mount glass designed for this camera. And that's why budget is relative to that comparison. If you're coming from Canon or Nikon, you should probably be going with the Mark III, because again, you're comparing it with a benchmark where you need all of these enhancements, because on many of the competing models that aren't in the same price range, but we'll call competing models, nor do they have the same feature set, but again, we'll call them competing models, you have some of the feature sets that are just vacant from the A7R Mark II. And one of those, the big ones, again, is battery life. As great as Sony is, battery life was not a strong suit of the A7R Mark II or any other full-frame camera that preceded it. Now, you don't have that issue. So if you're fresh to the ecosystem from Canon or Nikon, I think it's clear the A7R Mark III should be your purchase. So really the only justifiable reason, whether you're in the Sony ecosystem, out of it, I don't care, to buy the Mark II is budget. And that's not, again, a knock on the camera, because it's still expensive, but it still, for its price, is completely unmatched. Same can be said for the Mark III, but again, if you're a professional, enthusiast, hobbyist, whatever it may be, and you're ready to spend the money, you will never find yourself saying, I wish I had this feature, because the Mark III has all of the features. The Mark II, on the other hand, I've gone through everything. Battery life, autofocus, SD card support, Type-C being vacant. These are all things that inherently, at one point or another, you may find yourself, saying, I wish I had the Mark III. And that's why budget would be my only reason to recommend the A7R Mark II to anyone, because it's still an amazing camera for its current cost. But with all of that in mind, the Mark III is really the king of the Mark. It does set the new standard for all of DI. And even though the A9 is out there, the A9 does not appeal to as wide an audience, both in the professional and non-professional realm, as the A7R Mark III. In fact, that's the very reason I myself did not keep the A9, because as I mentioned earlier in this video, I anticipated we were going to get an update to this camera, whether it was a more expensive camera. I'm glad it was not. I'm glad it was not an A9R, because God knows what that would have cost. And they may still do that. I know they're definitely going to come out with an A7S Mark III. I mean, that is, well, actually, I'm not 100% sure, but I would bet money on it, even though I don't generally bet. But again, the A7R Mark III will never put you in a position where you're saying, I wish I had X, Y, or Z. The Mark II, amazing, but you will find yourself as happy as you could be with it, which I have been incredible. Look, mine got destroyed by Hurricane Matthew. I rebought it because there was nothing better, in my opinion, in its class. And when the A9 came along, I said, maybe this is it. But I knew Sony had something else, and I'm glad that I waited, because had I kept the A9, I would have been disappointed, because no matter how amazing that 20 frames per second and buffer are, which, by the way, the buffer is also superior here, something I didn't mention, to the A7R Mark II, I know that I would have regretted that purchase. The A7R Mark III is a zero regret situation. The Mark II, you know what you're getting yourself into. I've made it clear. This video is long enough. You're getting a lot more than what you're paying for, but you still may find yourself wishing you had more. And if that's the case, you got to work with what you can get and be glad that this body has gone down in price as much as it has. Part of the reason it's held value is because it didn't get replaced until now. And by the way, Sony never likes to say replaced. It's complemented. So as far as I know, the Mark II hasn't been phased out. They may phase it out, but I see it still holding a position because it's still a great camera at an incredible price. Another thing to point out, slow motion video. If you want to shoot 120 frames per second here on body, you can do that at 1080p. You cannot do that in the 4K realm. So that's another noteworthy thing that the A7R Mark III has going for it. But since all of that can be done in post, I don't really see that being a game-changing feature. So again, this is really a matter of budget. Otherwise, this is a no-brainer, because the A7R Mark III takes everyone out in terms of competition from other manufacturers, and even internally within Sony, in my opinion, is by far and away a much better camera than the A9, which is only targeting sports photographers. And again, those are photographers that make their living off of that digital imaging tool. Now, I can see how the A7R Mark III paired with the A9 would be a match made in heaven for pros, because either one could be an A, and certainly either one could be a B. And combined together, and using the same battery type, vertical grip, you really do have a professional grade ecosystem that the Mark II opened the door to, and the Mark III has now taken the throne and is the complete product that Sony began 3 years ago when they introduced the A7R Mark II and, of course, the A7S Mark II. That pretty much rounds things out. I mean, either option you will not regret purchasing, but the Mark III is the modern camera I've expected from Sony for several years now, but profit motive, quite frankly, has kept the Mark II alive longer than anyone expected, because it really is just that good. But now, of course, we have a camera that potentially can last another 3 years easily, because of how large a step it takes forward from all of the great things that combine to equal the A7R Mark II and its success. So if you're looking for the best of both stills and videos capability, you'll find it in both of these. But of course, the Mark III is really the winner and king of the hill right now. And I put it beyond the A9 because I do believe sports photographers can shoot with the A7R Mark III as well. Of course, not at the same rapid succession and with the nearly unlimited buffer, but they get pretty close. That pretty much rounds things out. Hope you enjoyed this nearly 40-minute video. Xfinity is going to tax me for uploading this. It's probably going to be like, I don't know, 30 gigs in 4K. But you know how I roll. Any questions or comments, please feel free to post them. Hit that like button. And as usual, please feel free to subscribe. Later.